The front door had barely closed behind my in-laws when the man they said could no longer walk pushed aside his blanket, planted both feet on the hardwood floor, and stood up. His knees shook. His voice didn't. "Don't call them," he whispered. "They're trying to steal $7 million from me." I wish I could tell you I handled that moment with professional calm. I'm a physical therapist. I've worked with stroke patients, spinal injuries, hip replacements, and one retired dentist who threw his walker at me because I wouldn't let him skip leg exercises. I'm trained to stay level-headed. Still, when Walter Mitchell stood up, I nearly dropped a glass of sweet tea all over my shoes. "Sit down," I said. Walter frowned. "That's what everybody keeps telling me." "Mr. Mitchell." "Walter, if we're about to commit treason against my brother, we should probably use first names." He took one careful step toward me, gripping the arm of his recliner. His back was bent, and his left knee trembled beneath his pajama pants. He was not moving like a healthy man, but he also wasn't moving like someone who had supposedly been paralyzed by a massive stroke 11 months earlier. That difference mattered. I'd noticed it before Frank and Marilyn even left. That morning, I'd arrived at their house in Farragut at 8:15 with an overnight bag, a travel mug from Pilot, and a bad attitude I was trying to hide. My husband Daniel was in Nashville handling an emergency inventory audit at one of his company's distribution centers. He'd been gone 3 days and expected to stay through the following Tuesday. Meanwhile, his parents were leaving for a 2-week Caribbean cruise. They had booked it months earlier, but somehow Walter's care became my emergency at the last possible minute. Frank stood in the foyer wearing pressed khakis and a navy polo with a tiny sailboat stitched over the chest. At 77, he still dressed like he might be called into a country club meeting without warning. "You're a professional," he told me. "This will be easy for you." I looked past him at Walter, who sat under a gray blanket near the living room window. "Home health care isn't easy just because I work in rehabilitation." Marilyn wheeled a pink suitcase toward the door. It was large enough to transport a medium-sized refrigerator. "Oh, Laura, he sleeps most of the day." Walter's eyes moved toward her. Just his eyes. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was his right hand. Frank had told us Walter's stroke left that side weak, but when Marilyn leaned over to tuck in his blanket, Walter lifted his fingers just enough to stop the fabric from catching under his wrist. It was a small movement, controlled, precise, not impossible for a stroke survivor, of course. Recovery looks different for everybody, but it didn't match the helpless picture Frank had painted for nearly a year. Then I saw Walter's slippers. The soles were lightly worn near the heels. People who never stood did not wear down the heels of their slippers. I crouched beside him. "Good morning, Walter. Do you know who I am?" His eyes met mine immediately. Frank answered for him. "He has good days and bad days." I asked Walter. Frank's smile tightened. Walter blinked once, slowly, then let his gaze drift toward the window. At the time, I assumed he was afraid of Frank's temper. I just didn't yet understand why. Marilyn handed me a yellow legal pad covered in instructions. Breakfast at 8, pills at 8:30, lunch at noon, crushed tablets and applesauce, no walking, no phone calls. That last one made me look up. "No phone calls?" "He gets confused," Frank said. "Last month he tried calling an attorney." Walter's eyes shifted toward him. Frank laughed like this was a charming story about a toddler dialing the fire department. Said we were stealing from him, can you imagine? I looked at Marilyn. She busied herself adjusting the strap on her purse. Then Frank clapped me on the shoulder. "Family takes care of family." That phrase had been used on me so many times during my marriage that it had started to sound less like a value and more like a bill collector. They loaded their bags into a black Lincoln Navigator. Marilyn complained that Frank had packed too many shoes. Frank said cruise ships had dress codes. She told him no one in St. Thomas cared about his loafers. Normal married bickering. That was almost the strangest part. They drove away looking like any retired couple heading toward 2 weeks of buffets, bingo, and cocktails with fruit stuck on the rim. I watched their SUV disappear around the curve. Then I closed the door. 5 minutes later, Walter stood up. Now he was beside the recliner, breathing hard. I reached for my phone. He lifted one hand. "Please don't call Frank." I wasn't calling Frank. I was considering 911. That would eventually lead to Frank. "Then sit down before you fall and make both of us explain this to a paramedic." He lowered himself into the chair. Not gracefully. His knee cracked loudly enough to make me wince. Walter rubbed it. Getting old is mostly discovering new places your body can make noise. Despite myself, I almost laughed. Almost. I pulled a dining chair across from him and sat. "Start talking." He glanced toward the front window, checking the driveway. "I did not have a stroke." "What happened?" "Pneumonia, bad case. Spent 9 days at Park West Medical Center, then 3 weeks in rehab. I was weak, but my brain worked fine." "So why does everyone believe you can't walk or speak?" "Because Frank told them that. And after a while I stopped correcting him." "That made no sense." "You pretended to be incapacitated for 11 months? I pretended to be worse than I was." "Why?" His face changed. The dry humor disappeared, and for the first time I saw how tired he really was. Because when I argued, Frank threatened to put me in a nursing home. He said he'd have me declared incompetent. Said nobody would believe an old man who couldn't remember where he'd put his checkbook. "Could you remember?" I knew exactly where it was. Frank had it. Walter pointed toward a narrow cabinet beside the fireplace. "Bottom drawer. There's a false panel." I didn't move. If this is some kind of family dispute, I'm not getting involved without Daniel. "You're already involved. Frank made sure of that when he left you here." That landed harder than I wanted it to. I crossed the room and opened the drawer. Beneath a stack of old Southern Living magazines, I found a thin wooden panel. It lifted easily. Inside was a large envelope. The first page was a petition for emergency guardianship filed in Knox County. The petitioner was Frank Mitchell. Walter's name appeared below it. The filing date was 3 days earlier. I skimmed the allegations. Severe cognitive impairment, inability to manage finances, risk of self-harm, need for immediate placement in supervised care. Attached was a request to control Walter's residence and financial accounts. My stomach tightened. "Did you sign any of this?" "No." "Do you have an attorney?" "When I trust. Frank watches the house phone and takes my mail. I managed to reach her once through a friend from church, but she needs proof I'm capable of making my own decisions." "You could speak in court. If Frank gets me there first. His plan is to move me into a facility the day after they return. Once I'm inside, every protest becomes another symptom." I looked at the papers again. "What does he want you to sign?" "Permission to sell my house and change the account authority." "And the $7 million? Walter leaned closer. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "That's what he thinks he'll control once the court gives him control of me." Before I could ask another question, my phone rang. Frank Mitchell flashed across the screen. Video call. Walter moved faster than I expected. He pulled the blanket over his legs, slumped sideways in the chair, and let his mouth hang slightly open. The change was unsettling. 1 second he was a sharp, frightened man asking for help. The next, he looked exactly like the helpless patient Frank had described. The phone kept ringing. Walter stared at me without moving his head. I had known my father-in-law for 6 years. Daniel trusted him. The entire family treated his word like a notarized document. And now an 81-year-old man was asking me to lie to him. I pressed accept. Frank's tanned face filled the screen, with an airport bar behind him. "Everything all right?" he asked. I glanced at Walter, then I looked back at Frank. "Everything's exactly the way you left it." Walter closed his eyes. And for the first time since I married into that family, I chose my side. Frank smiled into the camera, not warmly. More like a man checking that a package had arrived undamaged. "Let me see him." I turned the phone toward Walter. He lay under the gray blanket with his head tilted toward the window. His eyes were half closed, one hand resting loose against his chest. If I hadn't watched him stand 5 minutes earlier, I would have believed every word Frank had told us. Marilyn leaned into the frame beside him. Behind them, airport announcements echoed through the terminal. "Did he take his morning pills?" she asked. "Not yet. You need to crush them in applesauce." "I know how medication works, Marilyn." Her mouth tightened. Frank laughed, though nothing was funny. "Laura's got it handled, that's why we picked her." Picked me, like I was the most convenient wrench in the garage. Frank lifted his drink, something orange with a paper umbrella. "Make sure he doesn't try getting up. Sometimes he gets ideas." I looked at Walter. His face didn't move, but one finger pressed into the blanket. "What kind of ideas?" I asked. Frank's smile faded by half an inch. "That he can still do things for himself." There it was. Not concern, not sadness, control. "We're boarding soon," Marilyn said quickly. "Call if anything changes." "I will." Frank pointed at the screen. "Anything." Then the call ended. For several seconds, neither Walter nor I moved. Finally, he opened one eye. "You lie better than I expected." "I didn't lie. You said everything was exactly how they left it." "It was. You were still frightened, and I was still being ordered around." He sat up and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, that's almost poetic." "Don't get excited. I'm not on your side yet." "Of course not. I'm on the side of whatever is true. That's usually the side nobody wants at Thanksgiving." I pulled the yellow legal pad from the kitchen counter and sat across from him. "Let's start over. Medical history, every diagnosis, every hospital stay, every medication." Walter looked offended. "I thought we were discussing $7 million. We'll get there after blood pressure." That is exactly the kind of sentence that makes old men stop trusting healthcare. I ignored him. For the next 40 minutes, I assessed him the way I would any new patient. I asked the date. He gave me the day, month, year, and complained that cable news had made the last decade feel twice as long. I asked him to remember 3 words: apple, chair, river, and repeat them later. He did. I tested grip strength, ankle movement, facial symmetry, balance, speech, and coordination. He had stiffness, arthritis, and some weakness from reduced activity. His left knee was unstable, his shoulders were tight, his breathing was shallow when he walked farther than 20 feet. But there was no obvious paralysis, no aphasia, no one-sided neglect, nothing that matched a devastating stroke. When I asked for the 3 words again, he said, "Apple, chair, river," and Frank is a thief, though I understand that wasn't part of the test. I sat back. "You need a physician to document this." "I know." "You also need to stop performing for me." His eyebrows lifted. "Meaning?" "You're trying to be funny because you're scared." That silenced him. Walter looked down at his hands. The skin across his knuckles was thin and spotted. One fingernail was cracked near the edge. "I've had 11 months to be scared," he said. "I'm tired of giving it my full attention." That was the first moment I stopped seeing him as a clever old man playing a long game. He was clever, no question, but he was also 81, trapped in his younger brother's house, pretending not to understand conversations about where he would be placed and what would happen to his property. Cleverness had not made any of that painless. I gathered the pill bottles from the kitchen. There were medications for blood pressure, inflammation, sleep, reflux, and muscle spasms. Nothing exotic, nothing that screamed criminal poisoning, but several prescriptions should have been reviewed months earlier. "Who renews these?" "Doctor in Oak Ridge. Video appointments." "Does he examine you?" "Frank answers most of the questions." Of course he did. I held up the sleep medication. "Do you take this?" "Not usually." "Marilyn watches you." "I put it inside my cheek." "And then?" He nodded toward the downstairs bathroom. Inside the vanity, behind a can of shaving cream, I found a zippered plastic bag wrapped in an old washcloth. It contained dozens of tablets. I stared at it. "You've been saving these?" "Couldn't flush them. Frank watches the water bill like the Tennessee Valley Authority might steal the pipes." "That doesn't even make sense." "It does to Frank." I brought the bag back into the kitchen. Walter watched my face carefully. You believe me now? I believe you've been hiding medication. That sounded disappointingly clinical. I'm trying not to accuse anyone of crimes before I know what happened. Frank has never allowed ignorance to slow him down. I called Dr. Susan Avery just before noon. Susan had supervised neurological rehabilitation at Park West for years before cutting back to 2 clinic days a week. She was 63, sharp as a tack, and capable of making a grown orthopedic surgeon apologize with one raised eyebrow. She answered on the 4th ring. Laura, somebody better be bleeding. No one's bleeding. Then this must be personal. I stepped onto the back porch where Walter couldn't hear every word. I explained the situation carefully, leaving out names at first. Susan listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, Are you treating this person? No. Do you have access to his medical record? No. Good, keep it that way. I need someone to examine him. You need his consent and an appointment. He consents. Then he can call my office Monday. That may be too late. Susan sighed. Laura, listen to me. You might be absolutely right. But if the family claims you manipulated an impaired elderly man, your professional credentials become part of the argument. I know. No, you understand the sentence. That's different from knowing what it feels like when a licensing board sends a certified letter. I leaned against the porch rail. In the yard, a squirrel dug furiously beside Marilyn's bird feeder, scattering mulch like it had a personal grudge. What am I supposed to do? Leave? You're supposed to document what you personally observe. Don't diagnose, don't steal records, don't alter medication without a prescriber, and find his attorney. When I returned inside, Walter was standing at the kitchen counter, reaching for the coffee pot, his left leg buckled. I crossed the room fast enough to catch his arm before he hit the granite. For one ugly second, most of his weight dropped against me. He gasped and grabbed the counter. Easy, I said. Don't move. I'm fine. You nearly introduced your forehead to the countertop. I said nearly. His confidence had vanished. Sweat stood out along his hairline. I helped him into a chair. That stumble bothered me more than the legal documents. Walter had maintained enough strength to move around secretly, but not enough to be safe. If he fell and fractured a hip, Frank's entire story could become true through sheer neglect. I looked at my overnight bag near the stairs. I could leave, call Daniel, call Adult Protective Services, hand the whole mess to somebody else. I imagined Frank telling the family I had confused Walter, frightened him, maybe even encouraged him to hide medication. Daniel would be caught in the middle. My employer might hear about it. My first marriage had taught me how quickly a family could turn one disagreement into a permanent character defect. Walter followed my eyes. You should go, he said. That surprised me. You've done more than anyone else. And what will you do? Wait for another chance. At 81? He gave me a tired smile. I've already bought the non-refundable ticket. I sat down across from him. If I stay, we do this legally. Yes, ma'am. No secret medical opinions, no taking papers that aren't yours, no dramatic schemes involving fake deaths, hidden cameras, or disguises. Walter looked almost disappointed. I had not considered disguises. I'm serious. So am I. My knees couldn't support a costume change. I pointed toward the phone. Who is your attorney? Margaret Ellis, Maryville. Does she know what's happening? Some of it. He gave me a number and a phrase. When I called, a receptionist answered. I said Walter Mitchell needed to speak with Margaret urgently. There was a pause. Then I gave the phrase Walter had provided. Tell her the red tractor still has the original key. The receptionist went silent. Less than 30 seconds later, Margaret came on the line. Her voice was low and controlled. Is Walter safe? For now. Can he speak freely? I handed him the phone. Walter said, Hello, Maggie. His eyes closed for a moment when she answered. That tiny expression told me more than any stack of documents. Relief, real relief. They spoke for several minutes. Then Walter passed the phone back. Margaret told me to bring him to her office at 9 the next morning. "Do not discuss this with Frank," she said. "I wasn't planning to. There's something else." I grabbed the legal pad. "What?" Frank filed the guardianship petition before leaving for the cruise. He also contacted a real estate appraiser and requested paperwork to change signing authority on Walter's operating account. I looked toward Walter. He was watching me. "Can Frank access the $7 million?" I asked. Margaret paused. "Not the way he thinks he can." "What does that mean?" "It means Frank believes he still has time." She lowered her voice. "He doesn't know Walter moved first." The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I slept well, because I didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Frank saying, "Family takes care of family." Funny how people sometimes use that sentence right before asking you to ignore your own conscience. Walter was already awake when I came downstairs. He'd made coffee. Well, made might be generous. The coffee looked like it had lost a fight with hot water. He pushed a mug toward me anyway. I remembered how. I took one sip. "Your memory's excellent. It tastes that bad?" I'm trying to decide whether to drink it or patch potholes with it. For the first time since I'd met him, Walter laughed without forcing it. "I've been making coffee since Eisenhower." "Then Eisenhower deserved better." He grinned. "You sound like my late wife." I'll take that as a compliment. It was. For a few minutes, the tension eased. That mattered. People think fear is constant. It isn't. It comes in waves. Sometimes the wave goes out just long enough for you to remember you're still alive. By 8:30, we were on our way to Maryville in my old Subaru. Walter insisted on sitting in the front seat. Getting him into the car took nearly 5 minutes. His knees hurt. His lower back stiffened every time he twisted. When he finally settled into the seat, he let out a long sigh. "You know what nobody tells you about getting old?" "I have a feeling you're going to tell me." "You don't stop planning your day." He looked out the windshield. "You just start planning it around where the nearest chair is." I smiled. That might be the most accurate thing I've heard all week. Margaret Ellis's office occupied an old brick building just off Court Street. Nothing fancy, no marble lobby, no giant reception desk, just polished hardwood floors, framed family photographs, and shelves full of law books that looked like they'd been opened recently instead of purchased for decoration. Margaret met us herself. She was nearly 70, silver-haired, wearing a navy blazer and sensible shoes. The kind of woman who made you sit a little straighter without saying a word. She hugged Walter, not politely, like she'd genuinely been worried. "I've missed seeing you stand." Walter smiled. "So have I." She looked at me. "You must be Laura." "I am." "Thank you." "I haven't done anything yet." "You answered the phone." She motioned us into her office. As soon as the door closed, Margaret became all business. She slid several folders across the desk. "Frank believes the guardianship hearing will be routine." Walter nodded. "He always thinks paperwork is stronger than truth." "Sometimes it is," Margaret replied quietly. That sentence landed harder than I expected. She opened the first folder. 3 months ago, Walter contacted me through Reverend Collins. She looked at me. Frank was monitoring Walter's mail, checking his caller ID and attending nearly every appointment. "So how did you meet?" "The church food pantry." Walter smiled. "Nobody pays attention to two old people arguing over canned peaches." Margaret laughed softly. "He insisted the peaches packed in juice were superior." "They are." "They're absolutely not." For a moment, they sounded like siblings, instead of lawyer and client. Then Margaret opened another file. This contains 2 independent capacity evaluations. She pushed copies toward me. Different physicians, different dates. Both concluded the same thing. Walter understood his finances. He understood legal consequences. He had full decision-making capacity. "So why didn't this stop Frank?" I asked. because Frank never saw these. Margaret folded her hands. Before Frank filed for guardianship, Walter revoked the old power of attorney. She slid another document forward. He also appointed our firm and an independent trust company as successor fiduciaries. I looked up. So the money, most of it is already protected. Walter finally spoke. I didn't move it because I wanted revenge. He looked down at his wedding ring. I moved it because I wanted to sleep. Margaret nodded. The trust now owns almost everything except Walter's personal checking account and this house. I frowned. Then why is Frank doing all this? Because he doesn't know. Margaret leaned back. He believes guardianship gives him control over every asset Walter owns. It doesn't. Not automatically. She smiled faintly. Frank has confused authority with ownership. Walter chuckled. He always was bad with details. Then Margaret's expression became serious again. The problem is the house. She pointed to another document. If Frank becomes guardian, even temporarily, he could petition to sell this property to pay for Walter's care. He already contacted an appraiser, I said. Yes. And requested authority over the operating account. Correct. So even if he can't reach the trust, he can still make Walter's life miserable. The room became very quiet. That was the thing about older adults. People assumed financial abuse was only about money. It wasn't. Sometimes it was about deciding where somebody slept, who they saw, whether they got to keep their dog, whether they stayed in the home where they'd buried a spouse. Control. That was the real currency. Margaret wasn't finished. Frank filed before leaving for the cruise because he expected Walter to decline while he was gone. Walter snorted. I've disappointed him again. He expected Laura to confirm your condition. I blinked. What? Margaret pointed toward me. You're licensed, experienced, trustworthy. She paused. Frank thought your observations would strengthen his case. For the first time, I realized exactly why Frank had insisted I stay. He hadn't picked me because I was qualified. He'd picked me because my professional opinion carried weight. He'd expected me to say Walter truly couldn't function. Instead, I'd become his worst witness. As we were leaving Margaret's office, my phone rang. Daniel. I smiled automatically. Then I answered. Hey. His voice was flat. Where are you? Maryville. Silence. Then, my dad just called. My stomach tightened. What did he say? He said you took Uncle Walter somewhere without telling anyone. I looked at Walter. He closed his eyes. He says you're convincing Walter that everyone's stealing from him. I took a slow breath. Daniel. Laura. He sounded exhausted. Please tell me this isn't true. It depends which part. He sighed. I left Nashville an hour ago. What? I'm driving home. Daniel, I need to hear this from both of you. The line went dead. We reached the house just after 1 o'clock. Walter went inside to rest while I unpacked the groceries we'd picked up on the way home. I barely finished putting milk into the refrigerator before I heard tires in the driveway. Daniel's pickup. He came through the front door carrying an overnight bag. His face looked older than it had 4 days earlier. He kissed my cheek automatically. Then looked around. Where's Uncle Walter? In the kitchen. Walter walked in holding a coffee mug. Not dramatically. Not making a speech. Just walking. Daniel froze. The mug slipped from his hand and shattered across the tile floor. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Daniel whispered, How? Walter smiled sadly. I've been waiting a long time for somebody to ask the right question. Daniel looked at me, then back at Walter, then at me again. His face hardened. What the hell is going on? I started explaining. Everything. The pneumonia, the fake decline. The guardianship, the trust, the hidden medication, the attorney, the evaluation. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he shook his head. No, Walter blinked. No? Daniel looked directly at me. You should have called me before you did any of this. I had less than 24 hours. You still should have called. I didn't know who to trust. You didn't trust me? I was afraid you'd trust your father first. Silence. Daniel didn't answer. Because we both knew I was right. His jaw tightened. My father would never... Walter interrupted gently. Daniel turned. Walter reached into his shirt pocket. He removed a folded envelope. I've carried this around for 3 months. Daniel opened it. Inside was a photocopy of a letter. It was addressed to the trust company. Signed, Walter Mitchell. Except, it wasn't Walter's signature. Even from across the room, I recognized the handwriting. Frank's blocky capital W. His crooked Monsieur Daniel stared at it. His face slowly lost every trace of certainty. Walter spoke quietly. I never signed that, Daniel whispered. Dad did? Walter nodded once. The room fell silent. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. Inside, the only sound was Daniel slowly folding the letter back into the envelope. Then he looked at me. For the first time, he wasn't asking whether I believed his father. He was wondering whether he'd ever really known him. If you've ever dreaded a family dinner, you already know the feeling. You straighten the tablecloth twice. You wipe a clean counter because your hands need something to do. You rehearse conversations that never happen the way you imagine. That Sunday afternoon, I baked a peach cobbler I had absolutely no interest in eating. Daniel grilled burgers on the back patio without saying much. We'd talked for hours after he read the forged letter. He apologized. I appreciated it. But apologies don't erase 6 years of instinct. He admitted something that hurt more than I expected. I didn't realize how automatically I believed my dad. I know. I hate that you're right. So do I. Neither of us raised our voices. Some truths don't need shouting. Walter sat on the porch swing watching hummingbirds fight over Marilyn's feeder. He had insisted on using his cane. Not because he needed it every second, because he did need it sometimes. I refuse to make a dramatic entrance and then fall into the potato salad, he said. That's a reasonable goal. I've reached the age where avoiding embarrassment counts as cardio. I laughed. So that's your workout plan? 3 sets of not humiliating myself. Frank and Marilyn pulled into the driveway just after 3. The Lincoln looked dusty from 14 days on highways and parking garages. Frank climbed out first, wearing a bright blue polo shirt with tiny palm trees stitched across it. Marilyn carried 2 shopping bags and a bakery box. I brought rum cake, she called before she even reached the porch. She kissed Daniel. She hugged me. It was one of those quick hugs people give when they're checking whether you're still useful. Frank slapped Daniel on the shoulder. Everything survive? So far. Good. Frank looked toward the living room. Where's Walter? I kept my face calm. Out back. Frank smiled. I'll check on him after I unpack. You should probably do it now, I said. Something in my voice made him pause. He frowned. What does that mean? It means, Daniel answered quietly, you should come outside. The backyard looked exactly the way it always had. Maple tree, brick patio, old charcoal grill Frank refused to replace because, according to him, gas grills are for impatient people. 2 folding tables, potato salad, baked beans, sweet tea. Margaret Ellis sat beneath the umbrella talking with Dr. Susan Avery. Frank stopped walking. What are they doing here? Margaret stood. Good afternoon, Frank. He looked at me. Laura? Before I answered, the sliding glass door opened. Walter stepped outside. Not quickly, not triumphantly. He rested one hand on his cane. His left knee was stiff. He took one careful step, then another. The yard became perfectly silent. Even the birds seemed to stop arguing. Marilyn's shopping bag slipped from her hand. The rum cake landed upside down on the patio. Oh my God! Walter smiled gently. Hello, Marilyn. She stared at him. I'm walking. Frank recovered first. His smile returned almost instantly. It looked practiced. My goodness, he laughed. That's wonderful. He walked toward Walter, with both arms open. It's a miracle. Walter didn't move. No, his voice stayed calm. It's physical therapy. Frank blinked. What? And finally being allowed to stand whenever I wanted. Nobody said a word. Daniel folded his arms. I watched Frank carefully. He wasn't surprised Walter was alive. He was surprised Walter was standing in front of witnesses. Those are very different reactions. Frank forced another laugh. Well, whatever happened, this is wonderful news. He turned toward Susan. Doctor, isn't recovery amazing sometimes? Susan looked him straight in the eye. I haven't treated Walter. Frank hesitated. But I evaluated him Friday. She folded her hands. He does not present like someone recovering from the catastrophic stroke you've been describing. Frank's smile disappeared. You don't know his history. Susan answered evenly. I know enough to say I'd like to review the records that created that history. Marilyn looked from Susan to Walter, to Frank. She whispered, Frank? He ignored her. Instead, he looked directly at me. What exactly have you been telling people? I've been asking questions. You had no right. Walter answered before I could. Actually, he smiled faintly. I invited her. Margaret opened a leather portfolio. Frank, before this becomes more emotional than necessary, Walter has asked me to explain several legal matters. Frank waved dismissively. I don't think that's necessary. Walter chuckled. You've been saying that for 11 months. Margaret laid several folders across the picnic table, not dramatically, neatly, each one labeled. Medical evaluations, guardianship filing. Power of attorney, revocation, trust, documents. Frank stared. His face slowly lost color. He looked at Walter. Went behind my back? Walter raised an eyebrow. I believe that's called privacy. Daniel almost smiled, almost. Frank grabbed one of the folders. This proves nothing. Margaret nodded. You're right. She pointed toward another document. This, however, explains why you contacted an appraiser 3 days before leaving for your cruise. Frank froze. You were planning to sell Walter's residence before any guardianship hearing had taken place. It was for his care, Walter spoke quietly. My care? Frank turned. Yes. Walter tilted his head. Then why did you ask First Tennessee Bank to redirect proceeds into Mitchell Development Partners? Nobody moved. Frank didn't answer. Walter continued. The Gatlinburg Project. Daniel looked sharply at his father. What project? Frank's jaw tightened. It's none of your business. It became my business when you used my uncle's house to save it. Marilyn sat down heavily. I told you we should wait. Frank shot her a look. Not now. She ignored him. You said we'd borrow the money. Her voice shook. You said once the condo's sold, we'd put everything back. Daniel stared at his mother. Mom. Tears filled her eyes. I thought... She swallowed. I thought Walter would never even notice. Walter closed his eyes for a second. Not angry, just tired. I noticed. Frank slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous, he pointed at me. She's manipulated him. I stood. I've done exactly one thing. He laughed harshly. Oh, really? I believed him enough to ask for proof. You wanted his money. Walter barked a laugh. That surprised everybody. Frank frowned. What's funny? Walter looked at him. If Laura wanted my money... He nodded toward the folders. She's the worst gold digger in Tennessee. Even Margaret smiled. Walter continued. She spent 2 weeks telling me what I legally couldn't do. I added, I've said no to Walter more than anyone at this table. Walter nodded proudly. She has. Frank looked around. Nobody was standing beside him anymore. Not Daniel, not Marilyn, not even himself. His confidence had started leaking away. Then he took one step toward Walter. We need to discuss this privately. Walter planted his cane. No, you're confused. No, I'm your brother. Walter's voice stayed gentle. And every private conversation we've had for the last year somehow ended with you speaking for me. Silence. So today, Walter smiled sadly. I'll speak for myself. Margaret reached into her briefcase one last time. She removed a single sheet of paper. Frank. He didn't look at her. This is confirmation from the trust company. He finally turned. What confirmation? Margaret met his eyes. The assets you expected to control, she paused deliberately, have not been under your reach for quite some time. Frank frowned. What are you talking about? Walter looked directly at his younger brother, then asked the question that changed Frank's expression completely. Frank. He rested both hands on his cane. Where exactly did you think my $7 million still was? Frank didn't answer, because for the first time, he realized he'd spent nearly a year trying to steal something that had quietly slipped out of his hands months before. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. Frank stood there staring at Walter as though the words had arrived in the wrong language. Finally, he laughed. Not because anything was funny, because he had run out of better options. That's impossible, Walter shrugged. So was me standing up. Frank turned to Margaret. Tell him he's wrong. Margaret didn't even glance at Walter. Instead, she opened the final folder in her briefcase. I'd be happy to. She removed several documents and spread them across the picnic table. The Mitchell Family Investment Trust was amended approximately 3 months ago. Frank frowned. No? Yes. The assets couldn't have been transferred. They were. You need my authorization. Margaret looked almost sympathetic. No, Frank, she paused. You needed Walter's. The color drained from Frank's face, but the guardianship had not been granted. The power of attorney was revoked. I never received. That wasn't legally required. Walter quietly sipped his iced tea while his younger brother's carefully constructed plan collapsed one document at a time. It reminded me of watching someone remove the wrong block from a Jenga tower. No explosion, just gravity doing its job. Daniel picked up one of the papers. So, Uncle Walter moved almost everything into the trust? Margaret nodded. Not because he wanted to hide assets. She looked around the table. Because he wanted independent management before anyone else could attempt to control his decisions. Walter smiled faintly. I spent 40 years building a business. He looked at Frank. I wasn't going to lose it because my younger brother discovered expensive hobbies. Daniel slowly turned toward his father. What expensive hobbies? Frank didn't answer. Margaret did. The Gatlinburg condominium development. Daniel blinked. I thought that project ended last year. It did. Walter answered. It ended badly. Margaret slid another document toward Daniel. The development company borrowed heavily. Daniel skimmed the first page, then the second. Then he looked at his father. You guaranteed these loans? Frank stared at the table. Yes. How much? No answer. Walter answered quietly. Enough that losing my house would have delayed the problem. But not solved it, Margaret added. Frank suddenly slammed both palms onto the picnic table. I was trying to save this family. The shout startled everyone. Even Frank seemed surprised by how desperate he sounded. I gave my whole life to this family. Walter looked at him for several long seconds. Then he asked softly, At what point did my life stop counting as part of that family? Frank opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Walter wasn't finished. When did helping become deciding? When did protecting become controlling? And when exactly did stealing become borrowing? Nobody interrupted him. Sometimes the quietest questions are the hardest to answer. Marilyn finally began crying, real crying, not dramatic, not theatrical, just the exhausted tears of someone who had spent too long convincing herself everything would somehow work out. I should have stopped you. Frank didn't look at her. You believed me. I wanted to. Her voice cracked. Those aren't the same thing. She turned toward Walter. I'm sorry. I knew he was meeting with Banks. She wiped her eyes. I knew he wanted the appraisal. She shook her head. I kept telling myself it would all be temporary. Walter nodded once. I believe you. Marilyn looked relieved. Then Walter continued. I also believe temporary lies become permanent habits. That sentence hit even harder than an accusation, because it was true. Frank suddenly reached for the folders. Margaret calmly placed one hand on top of them. I wouldn't. You can't keep these from me. They're not yours. Frank looked around desperately. Daniel. Daniel didn't move. Dad. His voice was quiet. Did you forge Uncle Walter's signature? Frank hesitated. That hesitation answered the question better than any confession could have. Daniel closed his eyes. I watched 30 years of certainty crack apart in about 5 seconds. When he opened them again, he looked older. I always thought you exaggerated. He laughed bitterly. I never imagined you invented an entire illness. Frank pointed toward Walter. He wasn't acting right. He was grieving. Walter answered. I'd buried my wife. Frank ignored him. He forgot things. Walter nodded. I forgot where I left my reading glasses. He smiled sadly. You declared me legally incompetent. Even Susan couldn't hide her disappointment. I've treated cognitive decline for decades. She looked directly at Frank. Do you know what hurts families the most? Frank said nothing. It isn't Alzheimer's. It isn't Parkinson's. It's when healthy people decide an older adult's voice no longer matters. Nobody called the police that afternoon. Real life usually doesn't work that way. Instead, Margaret gathered the documents. We'll file our response first thing tomorrow. She looked at Frank. We'll also notify the court that Walter has independent representation. Frank sank into a chair. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small, not because I pitied him, because control had been the thing making him look larger than everyone else. Without it, he was simply an aging man who had made one terrible decision after another, until there was nowhere left to stand. The next several months unfolded much more quietly than television would have you believe. Frank's guardianship petition was dismissed. The forged documents were referred to the appropriate investigators. The banks froze several pending transactions. Civil lawsuits from investors in the Gatlinburg project continued moving through court. Frank eventually sold his vacation cabin and several investment properties to settle part of his debt. Walter's trust remained untouched, exactly as he'd intended. Marilyn rented a small townhouse across Knoxville after filing for legal separation. She and Walter slowly rebuilt a cautious friendship. Not because he forgot, because carrying anger forever is exhausting when your knees already hurt every morning. Daniel and I started marriage counseling. His first sentence during our initial session surprised me. I don't need help loving my wife. He reached over and squeezed my hand. I need help recognizing when I've stopped listening to her. Our counselor smiled. That's a better place to start than most couples. Healing wasn't dramatic. It looked like Daniel asking my opinion before calling his parents. It looked like me admitting when fear made me assume the worst. Little things. Real things. Walter moved into a small one-story home near the Maryville Greenway the following spring. He refused every suggestion that involved assisted living. I'll move there, he declared, the day bingo starts paying better than my investments. He hired a part-time caregiver. Not because anyone forced him, because he chose to. That distinction mattered to him. Every Tuesday morning we'd meet for coffee at a little cafe overlooking the trail. He still complained about my coffee recommendations. I still complained about his. Some arguments deserved to survive. A few months later, Walter established a charitable fund through the trust. Part of it paid for legal assistance for older adults facing financial exploitation. Another portion funded scholarships for physical therapy students at the University of Tennessee. When I thanked him, he shook his head. I'm not rewarding you. No. I'm investing. In what? He smiled. in the next stubborn woman who refuses to mind her own business. I laughed so hard the waitress had to refill my coffee. One afternoon, almost a year after that impossible morning, Walter handed me a small wooden box. Inside was an old brass compass. It was worn smooth from decades of use. "My father carried this." I looked at him. "I can't take something like this." "You can." He closed the box in my hands. "When Dad gave it to me, he said it wouldn't stop storms." He smiled. "It would only remind me which direction mattered." I still keep that compass in the top drawer of my desk. Not because it points north, because it reminds me that sometimes the hardest part of helping someone isn't lifting them back onto their feet, it's believing them before anyone else does. Getting older shouldn't mean surrendering your voice to whoever speaks the loudest. If there's an older person in your life, ask one more question before assuming you already know the answer. And if this story reminded you of someone, or of something you've lived through yourself, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Someone else may need to know they're not alone.